Hi everyone, and welcome to another installment of Terrifying Trios. This episode's theme is something that might not sound scary, but definitely can be. Anthologies. Here, this means a collection of scary stories knit together either by a common theme, motif, or, as with this month's book, truly nightmare-inducing illustrations. As always, let's start with a quick content warning. The following movies and book feature scenes involving murder, including beheadings, drowning, shootings, being eaten by werewolves, turning into a plant, being eaten by zombies, being consumed by bugs from the inside out, having your skin stolen by a scarecrow, sexual violence, violence against women, implied violence against children, bones being broken, vomiting, verbal abuse by a parent, verbal abuse by a spouse, spiders bursting out of someone's skin, cockroaches, general gore involving fake blood and corpses, and some nudity. Both the films this month are rated R, FYI. Viewer and reader discretion is, as always, advised. Our first movie is Creepshow, the classic horror anthology film that owes its legendary status to the likes of both George Romero and Stephen King, who appears in this movie in arguably his best and most haunting film performance ever as the doomed farmer, Jordy Verrill. The stories in the film are connected by the horror comic they come from. A dad with anger issues throws away a comic book belonging to his son, Billy. But Billy, having already sent away for a voodoo doll kit, ultimately has the last laugh. This is, of course, inaccurate movie voodoo and is not indicative of actual traditions or voodoo culture. We, the viewers, are, of course, invited to imagine a world in which children might buy working voodoo dolls, which is terrifying. Each of the 5 stories is extremely fun and at times scary, with varying lengths and pacing. The titular creep appears only to Billy in the prologue, and then between each story in the interstitial comic panels. This is maybe the horror anthology with the best cast ever. Ed Harris, Adrienne Barbeau, Hal Holbrook, and Stephen King, as well as his son, Joe Hill, who plays Billy in the prologue and conclusion, which I never knew until I started doing research for this episode. In one story, Leslie Nielsen gets revenge on his cheating wife by burying her alive up to her neck on the beach. Then, Ted Danson, the wife's boyfriend, is forced to also bury himself, while being held at gunpoint by Leslie Nielsen, and the lovers drown when the tide comes in. But then, they return to Leslie Nielsen's house to exact their own revenge. The final story in this anthology is probably the most horrifying of the 5, if only because it features an old and unpleasant rich man named Mr. Pratt with a phobia of bugs, who ultimately dies of fright after his panic room begins to fill with roaches. Then, after he dies, countless cockroaches burst out of him, or rather, the stand-in corpse. This movie was made in 1982, and the practical effects are great, because of course, they had to use real roaches. If you're looking for a movie full of entertaining tales of terror, some body horror, and solid performances, check out Creepshow. There's a comic adaptation you can read, too. Our second film, Trick or Treat, is one that I enjoyed for the first time this year, and in many ways it felt like a love letter to Creepshow. Both have a horror comic motif in the opening credits and in-between scenes that sets the stage for a gory celebration of the genre. This time, though, instead of the creep, we meet Sam, a cute little guy who wears a burlap mask with button eyes, and he loves candy, and he's also some kind of vengeful creature who punishes people for breaking Halloween traditions, like blowing out jack-o'-lanterns before the night is over, or, in one case, he punishes a man for murdering innocent children on Halloween. Sam either kills his victims or helps to facilitate their deaths, but if you give out candy, or have a lit jack-o'-lantern handy, you just might survive the holiday formerly known as Samhain. Maybe. Honestly, I'm amazed they haven't made more of these movies. Sam's the only recognizable Halloween character I can think of other than Jack and Sally from The Nightmare Before Christmas that hasn't spawned a franchise. Even people who have never seen this movie like Sam. And why not? His small stature and unassuming mask hide his real and terrifying face. And because of his cuteness, he's been merchandised more than the average Halloween character. And the single movie he appears in has become a cult classic. Since all of these stories are taking place in and around the same town on Halloween night, they're more interconnected than those in Creepshow, and the timeline of what is happening when to who is fun to discover as the film progresses, especially when characters you've gotten to know cross paths. For example, Near the start of the movie, we meet a serial killer whose son wants to carve a jack-o'-lantern. The dad seems unenthused, but that's in part because he's busy with the bodies he has buried in his backyard, which he doesn't want the old man next door to discover. Ultimately, the son and dad turn out to be cut from the same cloth, as their jack-o'-lantern is the severed head of a teenager who's now buried in the backyard pit. And the son specifically says more than once, "I need your help with the eyes, Dad." So that's fun. Later, the dad goes on a date downtown, which is the site of a kind of Halloween parade / bacchanal. And soon, the killer himself is killed by a monster of the non-human sort. Sam appears trick-or-treating with kids, watching the fun and mayhem of the night, and observing other characters, like the girl who survives a prank gone wrong, and the woman who blows out a jack-o'-lantern too early, and in the second instance, kills her and leaves her body in a ghoulish display for her husband to discover. Also, Anna Paquin plays a young woman whose Halloween has to be seen to be believed. This movie is filled with disturbing twists and characters who mostly get what's coming to them. And while there are many murders in this film, there are refreshingly few scenes of violence against women. There are some, but the majority of the people who survive the movie are women, which, in spite of the many final girls out there, is a low bar that isn't always cleared in horror films. If you're a fan of Sam, check out his movie this Halloween season. This month's book is a perennial Scholastic Book Fair favorite, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, by Alvin Schwartz, a folklorist who collected these tales into 3 volumes. Of course, the illustrations by Stephen Gammell are what really makes this book nightmarish, and truly for all ages of horror fans. But tales like The Red Spot, now that's the one with the spiders, Harold, the one with the scarecrow, and The Dream, where a woman with a very unique face appears, have stood the test of time for a reason. Passed down through generations, these stories range from urban legends that are fairly modern. The man with a hook for a hand attacking a couple in their car is a solidly 20th century myth, as is the tale of The Babysitter, where the calls are coming from inside the house, to stories that go back a ways, but are easy to update for modern times, like the tale Such Things Happen, in which a woman is suspected of witchcraft. A lot of these stories reveal universal societal worries about children being harmed, while also touching on fears about women with agency and distrust of other cultures and outsiders. In some ways, these stories are scary not just because of their explicit content, but also due to the implied racism, sexism, and xenophobia. Something that fascinates me about these stories as an adult is how women, in particular black women and people of color, are the people who kept these stories going for generations through oral history. Reading the footnotes of these stories gives you just a taste of who originally told them to a folklorist. Ultimately, though, it was white, usually male academics who recorded them and profited, in a way, from these stories in the 20th century, which is, of course, an inescapable part of the history of American enterprise, but also an interesting look at whose stories we value, and why, and under what circumstances. Cautionary tales for children have universal appeal, and if they're scary enough to discourage bad behavior, more's the better. But these tales are also fun, both to read and to share. They're thrilling and unsettling, and seem poised to survive or even flourish in the 21st century, just as they have for generations. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again soon with another terrifying trio.